Give us the backstory. What's up with the geese?
So I was living with this boyfriend who became my husband, and he was like, well, are you going to stay in Switzerland? And I was like, well, there are some conditions here. One, we got to have geese. We got married, we bought a house out in the countryside with enough space, and then we imported English geese.
Okay. Well, that is the first geese-related prenup provision that I've ever heard of, so that is very cool. You're listening to Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delevan.
That target is going to be missed for 2030. Like, it's already basically a guarantee. They are basically the only 4 projects that have a shot of being kind of up and running by 2030. They add up to about 3 gigawatts or so, I think.
You kind of buried the lead there, Paul.
If we had our great vision of being the Saudi Arabia of wind here in Ireland, that you would be able to transmit huge amounts of offshore wind power from Ireland to, say, the UK and Europe.
Well, listeners, it's episode 49. Thanks for sticking with us. 2024 has been crazy so far, and it's only going to get crazier. We're nearly the end of May, and we are going to see the results of the first of several huge elections around the world. India's polling numbers, where, of course, in Delhi, the temperature just topped 50 degrees C yesterday. We will find out whether or not Prime Minister Narendra Modi will continue on in office or not. We also found out that the ANC will lose its overall majority in South Africa. And about a week from now, we will find out how things are going with the European Parliament elections, which are expected to see a decline in support for parties like the Greens and an increase in support for the far right. Here in the UK, where Rishi Sunak has decided to protect his right flank, leaving the centre open for the Labour Party, but whether or not they will actually have a mandate to pursue the green policies that they campaigned on for the last couple of years remains to be seen. So we thought we'd bring you some commentary from Ireland, which we know a little bit about, having lived there for a bit, and brought you 2 spectacular journalists on our panel to discuss the stories of the week and the stories that they've been working on and how European elections might affect the industries they cover. We also bring you, very much delayed, our conversation with Jenny Chase, the amazing oracle of solar and author of Solar Power Finance Without the Jargon, a second edition, which we recorded earlier this year. But we thought, given the week that's in it, we found out that for the first time in really quite a long time, First Solar, a U.S. company, has actually overtaken, in market cap terms, a lot of its Chinese competitors because of a glut of solar panels on the market. That this would be a good time to bring you that conversation. Jenny Chase was writing at a time where the per watt cost of solar PV was like 24 cents a watt. It's now, in that solar glut in China, about 10 cents a watt. So we all give hostages to fortune when we put anything down in writing. I hope you'll appreciate our conversation with her, because it's ever enlightening. And also, we finally find out what's going on with the geese. Seriously, you'll enjoy it. Hope you enjoy these conversations. If you do, please do leave us a rating and review in the usual coordinates. Give us feedback on social media. And indeed, if you can stretch to it, come to wickedproblems.earth and become a supporter of our work. And now, here is our conversation with our journalist panel. Enjoy. The 31st of May, 2024, a little over a week away from the European elections for the European Parliament. I'm here joined for Week in Climate Tech with 2 distinguished panelists. First, John Reynolds, freelance journalist whose work you can see in The Currency and The Independent and Sunday Independent in Ireland. And Paul O'Donoghue, who is the Ireland reporter for Renews.biz. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. And so what have you been covering this week?
No problem at all. No problem at all. Happy to be here. Very much been focused on the Ireland report for Renews, which is a bit of a mammoth publication that we pull together every year. So that's just very much kind of getting into the nitty gritty of the kind of main issues for onshore and offshore wind in the Ireland sector this year.
Well, we definitely want to come back to some of the particularities of what you've been covering and a lot of news flow on that this year. And John Reynolds, friend of the show, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, good to be here.
What have you been up to this week? And you're based where? I want to make sure if I'm talking to a Culchie and a Jackeen or just two Culchies. We are talking to two fellas who are in Ireland. So where are you located, John?
I'm based in Wicklow, so about an hour south of Dublin.
I kind of straddled the definition of both of those because I'm from Dublin, but from North County Dublin, which is considered the country by people in Dublin. So take your pick as to whether I'm a Culchie or a Jackeen.
Okay. Not all of our listeners will be fully au fait with these terms. I might put a glossary in the show notes to help people out. And careful listeners will remember that I lived in Ireland for 10 years and covered a lot of green tech in its infancy, really, that kind of first wave of renewables. But let's kick in. We're a week away from the first votes being cast across the European continent, one of the biggest elections in the world, for the European Parliament. Ireland being one of the countries. We no longer, of course, have European elections here in the UK, sadly. But it's always interesting because I think the trends that are going to be manifest during that election are going to affect a lot of things for the sector. And it's been a really kind of weird year in the sense that we've had great progress and the European Parliament's been a big part of that. We had Kieran Cuff, MEP, on the program in March talking about kind of one of the particular pieces of legislation that he helped kind of quarterback about retrofitting buildings. But we've also had what we've been calling on this show Greenlash. We've had massive protests by farmers in February across the continent, against particularly on climate policies, things that might affect costs. Also, they're being affected by the energy crisis affecting their costs for fertilizer, costs for fuel, everything else. And we've had governments that have now been, particularly here in the UK, where there are other elections going on, playing around with potentially turning their back on some of their earlier net zero commitments. So we wanted to get a sense, and all of this happens in the backdrop, of course, of a report came out last week from the World Weather Attribution kind of network of scientists saying that autumn and winter storm rainfall in the UK and Ireland was made 20% heavier by human-caused climate change. But is climate actually even on the ballot? Is it something that people are talking about on the doorsteps? John, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I suppose if I look back at earlier this month, there was a Sunday Independent Ireland Thinks poll, and we saw in that climate issues were languishing in 5th place in the ranking of priorities for voters. And unfortunately, like elsewhere in the UK and Europe, immigration was rising pretty fast up the rankings. It was second, it was up, and housing was number one, which is an ongoing issue here in Ireland with a kind of a rental and housing crisis, again, which is something we're seeing not just here as well. But if you contrast that with climate in that poll, climate was actually down 1% in the rankings. It was at 5th. So it was behind cost of living, healthcare, immigration and housing. And as you say, we saw that recent news about the rainfall here in Ireland and the UK being made heavier. And I suppose there's probably a wider media issue there, which is probably a debate for another day in that a story like that does make the main evening news. It prompts debate on radio, on some of the popular radio shows here on our public service broadcaster, RTE. Like any other climate story, though, it probably doesn't quite get the depth of analysis and debate that it might merit. And that, if you look at it from a media analysis point of view, you might see how that contrasts with other issues which continue to resurface in the headlines and in the debate and in the opinion columns and on the airwaves here. There's an ongoing debate around offshore wind and how Ireland is very much languishing in the rankings there compared to the UK, compared to what's happening in Europe, for example. We've got other issues here which have a heavy climate context, the expansion of data centers here, the growth of which has actually cancelled out more or less some of our penetration of renewable energy. I suppose one interesting side note that I had looked at, but I haven't actually covered in any detail yet, was that when I was looking a bit deeper into the issue around the data centers, I actually discovered that one recently appointed member of Amazon's public affairs team here had a background in working for oil and gas giants.
I definitely want to come back to that and some of the things you've touched on there, because I think they're all quite relevant. But Paul, European elections famously are this weird thing, right? It's also the same day, the local elections, and I believe the first elected mayoral race in Limerick, I think at the same time. And of course, the Green Party is part of the governing coalition in Ireland. They did particularly well both in Ireland and across Europe at the last both national elections there and European elections. They're projected to come down from a high. You're covering very closely the onshore and offshore wind sectors in Ireland. Is it something that your sources, people you talk to, I mean, do they care? Are they watching this? Do they worry about it? Or am I just overreading this, Paul?
Yeah, so I mostly deal in talking to developers, the people who are building out onshore and offshore wind farms. And the main thing they're coming back with is they're not too concerned, but there is a bit of a caveat there in that they're not too concerned at the minute, but things could change pretty quickly. John touched on there, immigration wasn't a huge issue maybe 6 months ago. All of a sudden it's completely blown up. So I think there's people are a little bit wary there. So in terms of how the lay of the land is at the minute, or in terms of how developers see it, so the parties that are in government now, so that's Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and then the Green Party as well. So they're kind of traditionally the parties which have kind of always been in power. They all very much kind of favour renewable development. So if they were to get back in, it should be as she goes. If there was to be any kind of change in government, so Sinn Féin would be the obvious party which kind of might have a bit more influence. They're also seen to favour renewable energy as well. So again, developers aren't hugely concerned there. And there is even this kind of thing that you touched on as well about this being a European election rather than say like a national one. Like a lot of this stuff, it wouldn't even touch too much on say like Irish national policy anyway. The European stuff tends to lag behind in terms of when it has an impact here. So there's not like a huge amount of concern from developers about the results. But just going back to what I said about the caveat there would definitely be a concern that there is like a lot of opposition locally to wind farm developments. So basically people who don't live near wind farms, they don't really care too much about them, or they would tend to have relatively favorable views of them because renewable energy is a good thing. But for people who are actually living near wind farms, not all of them, but a reasonable chunk of them, they just don't like them going in for whatever reason. They don't like the look of them, building work, whatever it may be. So there does tend to be fairly significant local opposition to individual wind farm projects. So that kind of has fed through to a couple of the local councils. And if that was to catch on a few of the more rural areas, that could be a concern for developers because then the councils can change the rules a bit and make it a bit tougher for them to build.
Interesting. Obviously, everywhere in the world where there's local control about permitting and allowing a voice for people to object, usually it is objecting. Always want the wind farm to be somewhere else, just not here. That kind of brings us on to our second topic quite neatly. When I was working in journalism in Dublin, covering that first wave of renewables, and I know we'll talk about Eddie O'Connor, late Eddie O'Connor, in a moment, and some of the other pioneers who helped to bring onshore wind in a big way. But of course, the big promise was that, Ireland could be the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind, given all the resources that were there. Or tidal energy, maybe solar, but not so much, except maybe in Waterford or somewhere down in the sunny southeast. But wherever I check back, offshore wind never really seems to have taken off and made progress. And in fact, I was going back and looking at some of the stats, and the overall wind penetration in terms of the electricity generation mix in Ireland kind of flatlined 4 years ago and seems to have even fallen back. So perhaps that lack of progress in offshore, given that they're pretty chunky targets, as I believe, looking into 2030. But Paul, this is kind of your specialist subject. Why is offshore wind been lagging as much as it has?
Yeah, it's one that you would think that Ireland would kind of had built out more. Like you said, that kind of Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. It's like a nice catchy thing, isn't it? And it sounds like something that Ireland could be very much working towards. Ireland is known for being wet and windy, so why not take advantage of it? So in terms of why that hasn't happened yet, I suppose there are probably two main reasons. One is the focus has very much been on onshore development for a long time. And then two, just in terms of offshore development, it's more expensive, it's harder to do. And that kind of ties into how Ireland works in terms of delivering infrastructure, which is to say that we're not very good at it. It tends to take a long time, and it tends to be quite expensive when it's built here. So that's been the main barrier for offshore wind traditionally. Basically, take an offshore project from just an idea in someone's head to actually it being finished, turbines in the sea and producing electricity. That entire process, start to finish, normally takes over a decade. So the reason why it wouldn't have happened here is because there kind of wasn't a proper kind of government policy that supported developers. And like that, when it takes so long for them to build and there's a lot of uncertainties in Ireland's planning system, a lot of developers basically, they weren't willing to take the risk of trying to build out these projects only for something to go wrong, say 5 years into it or whatever, and then they're stuck with nothing. So there has been a bit of movement on this, well, a bit. There's been decent movement on this in the last kind of year or two. Last year saw Ireland's first kind of state auction for offshore wind. So this was basically a government support scheme which gives developers like a contract which guarantees a certain price. So
Right.
that kind of gives them like the certainty to build out. So a couple of projects are in the works from that.
So just to drill in on that for a second, is that similar to the auction process here in the UK? Is it like a CFD where you've got, again, this kind of floor price, but it's kind of reverse auction? You're having bids that come in to have the lowest possible price in order to be able to kind of get away, the contracts, or how does it work? What's the mechanism?
That is basically it. A bunch of developers have projects. They go into the auction. They say we can produce electricity at whatever price it is. The government looks at all the different bids and says, okay, these guys can produce it at 10 versus these guys who are saying at 9. So we'll go with the guys who are doing it cheaper. So price is one of the things developers complain about. They're saying it shouldn't just be price, it should be how good the project is. But yeah, basically price and how well developed the project is, they kind of tend to be the main things the government favors awarding contracts.
Right. And Bord Gáis, it looks like, was trying to get into offshore wind. What players are there other than Bord Gáis?
Yeah, so like there are a few different players actually. So going back to that auction that I mentioned just there. So a couple of different multinationals went in for that. So there's, say, Statkraft, which is a developer which is very active kind of across Europe. Ørsted as well, in a similar boat. SSE, which is obviously quite active in England, Scotland. So there's a fair few kind of, big established multinational companies who are coming in, and I suppose they want to be the first ones at the base of Ireland's offshore industry, because like you said, there's basically nothing in Ireland at the minute in terms of offshore wind. So they think that there's a good opportunity to build out from that.
Right. And there's a target, isn't there, for like 5 gigawatts of offshore to be installed capacity by 2030. And that is part of an 80% renewables target for electricity generation by that time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no, you're correct.
I'm just curious because I'm sitting here in the UK or like looking at what people are doing off the east coast of the US. And, like I think Dogger Bank alone off the eastern coast of the UK would be more than the entire offshore portfolio that's envisioned by 2030 for Ireland. So it's a difference of scale. But in terms of the demand drivers, given that renewables goal and the need for more renewables to be brought on, I guess, John, maybe I can ask you, the growth of demand, and particularly from data centers, and particularly driven by AI. I was reading this morning that it's like 10x the electricity requirement for a chat GPT query than an ordinary old-fashioned Google search before they started to incorporate AI in their results. So like it is a massive delta, and Ireland is home to a lot of the biggest brand names in tech, huge amount of data centers. And I did see somewhere that EirGrid had even stopped offering new connections for data centers around Dublin. So how does this square up?
The data center operators would argue, I think, that they play a key role in helping to drive that demand. They would also argue that it increases the baseline demand as well, which add to the economics of scale, which should make renewables more economically feasible. But I suppose the flip side to that is that you have to contrast, unfortunately, the pace of development with those two things. So, for example, if you compare the pace at which data centers have expanded to our unfortunate lagging in regards to offshore wind, there's a clear disconnect there. But you might argue that if the offshore wind guys had the same sort of lobbying power as perhaps some of our tech giants do, you wonder whether that picture might have changed. And I suppose the other point I've seen argued is that maybe if we were doing this again, we might try and construct a kind of a policy framework where you had the data centers maybe helping to drive grid improvements, which would facilitate renewables penetration. As I was saying earlier, we now are at a stage where the penetration of data centers here is such that it's actually displaced, the good work we've done on the renewable side of things in terms of our electricity fuel mix.
I saw somewhere that 30% of the entire electricity output of the country will be required for data centers by 2026. One of the other blockers sometimes for some of these projects is both connecting onto the grid itself and some of the other aspects of the grid that allow both those projects to get greenlit in the first place, but also present challenges for balancing load, for ensuring continuity. I heard from sources that like a couple of weeks ago, that the interconnectors, both of them between the UK and Ireland, went down in the middle of the night for about 4 hours. And miraculously, also because it was nighttime, no one really noticed, because otherwise, if it had happened at a peak time, it might have gone pretty badly and might have heard about it quite often. Might have become an election issue. Who knows? But it is something that grid enhancing technologies that squeeze a lot more value out of existing stuff. And Paul, you mentioned about how difficult it is to get infrastructure projects done really anywhere in the West. And so finding ways that use AI, IoT sensors, advanced materials to squeeze more stuff out of what they call GETs, these grid enhancing technologies. We did an episode with Current Europe and Inoda, a UK-based grid enhancing technology company, last week. But John, you've written extensively about a cluster, really, of GETs companies there in Ireland. Is it a bright spot, would you say, for the kind of climate tech scene in Ireland?
Yeah, quite possibly. It's the brightest climate tech spot here. We've got one which a colleague of mine on the Currency was covering, Thomas Huber. He was covering a company called Grid.Beyond, which recently did a Series C raise of, I think it was 52 million. And their technology helps businesses manage the extent to which they draw energy from the grid and balancing that with their own off-grid power sources. Again, it uses an element of machine learning / AI, whichever you want to call it, to make sure that they also try and not only predict the power price ahead, but they also try and obviously optimize the use of their own resources against grid electricity and therefore cut down their operating costs. So yeah, they're very much a bright spark. They're probably a slightly low-key company, if you like. As I say, that story of them raising the 52 million, and they've also been expanding in the US, and I believe they're looking to expand elsewhere as well. That got quite a lot of coverage at the time, and that would be, as I say, certainly one bright example in our climate tech sector. The other one you have is the late Eddie O'Connor's company Supernode, which again I've covered in detail, and I was catching up with them earlier in the year. It was really actually just touching on the fact that they've opened an R&D and testing facility in Blythe in the northeast of England, where I know they've got the offshore renewable catapult facility. So again, they're expanding there a little bit. They've also been doing some work at CERN in Switzerland. And they have a member of staff who's been seconded there. They're developing their IP, and they've got a number of patents now.
And John, I wanted to just to jump in there. Not everybody listening will necessarily be super familiar.
Sure.
Eddie O'Connor is this titanic figure in the history of Irish energy and technology, and it's somebody who came out of Borden and Mona, as I remember, pursuing renewables there, founded Airtricity, one of the first big renewables players, went on to found another company, Mainstream, to develop renewables projects, interestingly, mostly outside of Ireland, but around the world. And also then worked to help set up Supernode. And Supernode is doing superconductors. Eddie's no longer here to be able to kind of tell the story exactly in his way, but if you were to give it a go in 30 seconds, what does Supernode do and why should I care?
Supernode are trying to develop superconducting materials which will enable you to transmit more power through a cable than you can in existing HVDC cables, for example. The hope is that if we had our great vision of being, say, a Saudi Arabia of wind here in Ireland, that you would be able to transmit huge amounts of offshore wind power from Ireland to, say, the UK and Europe through such cables. There's a whole wider issue around whether a supergrid might emerge, ideally in Europe initially. And I think there's probably a wider issue to ask whether perhaps some pilot projects might one day be developed between, say, Ireland and Scotland, or Ireland and the UK. If you look at the fact that we've got interconnectors already at the moment, and also plans to even have even more of those, there's a question around whether we should use that as a basis perhaps for having a smaller kind of, if you like, a pilot supergrid, maybe between Ireland, Scotland and the UK, maybe even between Scandinavia at some point as well. And whether that could one day expand, which was the late Eddie O'Connor's vision, into a European supergrid, very much connecting solar power in the south of the continent and even perhaps North Africa one day. Then you'd have a whole swathe of not only onshore wind and solar, but offshore wind along the east coast of the continent.
I saw there's even a project being talked about using some of the existing kind of cable routes for transatlantic fiber optic to be able to lay some sort of mega HVDC, I don't know, presumably using some special, maybe even, who knows, supernose technology to be able to run a cable between Europe and the United States to actually start forming that a supergrid on a transatlantic basis, which would be interesting for lots of reasons. But Paul, I want to come back to you. Something that I always found interesting about an Eddie O'Connor character, where companies like Mainstream, companies even like Air Solaire, who is a former client, a former life, but good guys over there. But the work that they're doing tends to be outside of Ireland. And there are reasons for that, it seems. But do you have any memories of Eddie O'Connor, Paul? And what's your take about the potential for developers in this space who maybe are domestic players who find that they get their main opportunities abroad, partly because they get frustrated about the delays of getting infrastructure done at home?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly in terms of my own memories of Eddie O'Connor, I won't pretend that I knew him well. I did interview him in person before. He's a very nice man, very personal, like that, very super knowledgeable and super passionate as well, obviously, about renewable energy. He's obviously someone who worked more outside of Ireland than in it, at least towards the back end of his career. And so in terms of why developers do that, yeah, I mean, I can see why. We kind of touched, even you kind of touched before yourself, just the small scale, say, of Irish offshore. So say that 5 gigawatt target for 2030, which looks like kind of buttons or peanuts or whatever when you're looking at it from the UK or the US. And like that target is going to be missed for 2030. Like it's already basically a guarantee. Like that, those kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about those 4 projects being granted permission or kind of winning government contracts, they're basically the only 4 projects that have a shot of being kind of up and running by 2030. So those 4 projects together, they add up to about 3 gigawatts or so, I think.
You kind of buried the lead there, Paul. I mean, so basically they set this big audacious target for 2030. And, from what you're saying, that there's zero chance of actually meeting that target. And like some of these targets are relatively new. It just seems mad.
Yeah, no, it does. It seems wild like that. It's obviously only 2024 now. And we, developers who I'm speaking to, they're already saying with essentially 100% certainty that those 2030 targets, they are going to be missed. And that's just a fact. Because like that, you've got those 4 projects there. So they kind of add up to about 3 gigawatts between each other. And then in terms of what else is coming, so after those 4 projects, there's been this protracted process of trying to overhaul how offshore wind is developed in Ireland. So the government, basically how it worked before was that a developer would come to the government at one of these auctions and say, I've got a great idea to build a wind farm wherever. And the government looks at all of them individually and says, okay, I think your idea is best. Here's a contract. What the government is going to be doing now is saying, we, the government, have decided that this is the best place that you should build a wind farm, an offshore wind farm. And we think that there's enough space for, say, 2, 3, or 4 offshore wind projects. And you guys all have to make the best pitch as to who's going to be able to develop it. So that process has just started up. And because it's taking so long, the kind of first project that's going to be developed in that way, the auction for that is only going to be held later on this year. And already that project is probably not going to be delivered by 2030. And even there, John was kind of talking about grid issues, and we were talking about it earlier. Like even there, you can see where the grid issues come in and how that limits offshore developments, because that government plan is meant to be revolutionizing how offshore wind is developed. They've said that, right, in this space, we think that there's, a good way to build, say, 4 offshore wind farms. The grid down in that part of the country, it actually only has the capacity for one offshore wind farm. So unless we just kind of magic up grid capacity out of thin air over the next couple of years, there's only going to be one offshore wind farm built at this spot where we're saying we would like 4.
Gosh, I mean, that is mega. What I'm really shocked about is that I wasn't aware that the target is already basically dead in terms of big miss, but it's also the fact that it's not, again, it lacks salience as a political issue, because again, driving through the kind of permitting reform, the grid enhancements, the technologies that are needed to be able to do that seems like it remains the blocker. And it doesn't feel like we're going to resolve that at this moment. So look, I mean, we're going to head into a break, and then we'll have an interview with Jenny Chase, the doyen of solar with Bloomberg NEF. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. If you guys can both stay on for a few minutes, a couple other bits we wanted to cover as we head out towards this polling day coming up. So stay tuned.
Hey, here are some ads to help pay the bills. If you'd prefer a version without ads, subscribe to our member feed at wickedproblems.earth. A monthly subscription is cheaper than buying us a pint.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems, and I'm so excited that we could have Jenny Chase of Bloomberg NEF fame, and more importantly, the second edition of Solar Power Finance without the jargon. So, Jenny Chase, welcome to Wicked Problems.
Great to be here, Richard.
It's been 4 years or thereabouts since your first edition of the book that came out. But maybe take us a little bit further back, and I know you've told this story many times, but for our listeners, some of whom might need a little bit of reminding. So people have called you the Oracle of Solar, the Doyen of Solar, the Grande Dame of Solar, and because you've very humbly, in my opinion, often ascribe how you came to this position due to luck in how you got assigned a particular generation kind of technology when you're working with NEF. But take us back to that time and how you wound up becoming the person you are today in terms of your expertise in solar finance.
It was fairly random. I was working for this startup in 2005, and the boss said, look, someone should focus on solar. Jenny, you happen to be there, focus on solar. And I didn't really know anything in those days, so I was like, I've been writing about tech, I've been putting clean tech deals into our database, I've been writing basically news articles about solar, I can do this. And nobody else knew anything about it in those days either, really, like not who was talking about it in a financial way. I didn't know about anything about finance either, but like I really was too new to let that stop me. And Michael Liebreich, who was my boss, did know a lot about finance and a fair amount about tech. So at least I had some guidance or someone to yell at me if I got things wrong, at least. And yeah, so I started doing more on solar, and the clients started asking me questions, and then I had to find the answers to questions. And basically, if you do that, you find yourself knowing things, and then you find yourself with spreadsheets. An analyst is basically just a journalist with a couple of spreadsheets.
Right.
So that was pretty much what happened. And then the company hired some people and I had to manage them, which I also knew nothing about how to do. And then last year I stepped down from managing the solar team, which I'd done for 17 years, because I really just wanted to be an analyst and write about stuff and find things out.
Right.
I never wanted to do the management stuff.
I don't know if that's been a coincidence, but you were obviously working with NEF when it was a startup. You've helped to build that team on the solar side, but subsequently you, I presume, were working in the UK and then are now living in a small village in Switzerland, in part raising geese, which is not something that everybody knows, but I love that detail when I looked at your LinkedIn profile and see you there with the geese. Give us the backstory. What's up with the geese?
So the geese are kind of a family thing. These are West of England geese. They are a very ancient UK breed. They've been around since medieval times. What's really special about them is that the females are grey and white and the males are white. Most geese, you can't tell males from females very easily, which causes all kinds of difficulties when people keep geese. But this breed, if you keep them purebred, you can tell. And my parents actually wrote the breed standard in 1990 something. It's an ancient breed, but nobody actually got around to writing it down. And my parents have done a lot of keeping this breed alive in the UK. So I was living with this boyfriend who became my husband, and he was like, well, are you going to stay in Switzerland? And I was like, well, like, there are some conditions here. One, we got to have geese. So yeah, we got married, we bought a house out in the countryside with enough space, and then we imported English geese.
Okay. Well, that is the first geese-related prenup provision that I've ever heard of, so that is very cool. And congratulations on getting your way with that deal. It's kind of a random question, but at the same time, I think one of the things that people really respect and enjoy about your work and what makes it different, perhaps, than other journalists with spreadsheets, as it were, is that you seem to be able to understand the human element when it comes to deal making and how that forms the bedrock of the dynamics of any industry, but in particular one that has grown as quickly with as many colorful characters, let's say, on the development side and on the trading side that this one has. And so I guess my next question is really about how you think that has informed a lot of your work. You're there with the spreadsheets, but you're also talking to people who are putting these deals together and seem to understand. I heard you say to someone else recently that when people are putting in their kind of project bids to get a project developed, they're probably lowballing a lot on the maintenance side and OpEx because they know they have to get the deal across the line and they probably won't be in the same job by the time those numbers will actually wash out through the system. I mean, that's not a perspective you hear every day. It's one I think people can relate to. So am I wrong on this, or is that something that informs your worldview a little bit differently, perhaps, than a lot of other people in your business?
I think the really major thing is that I don't have much technical finance training. So a lot of people think about finance as being about betas or capital asset pricing models or complicated risk things. But and like all of those are important, you should understand them. But when it comes right down to it, you're doing a lot of guessing about what risk really means in this business. And you're also doing a lot of deciding who to trust. And that is a human thing. And it not, I think, something that you're necessarily taught in finance circles.
No, indeed. It's not something, I think, if you're getting your MBA, that the stark truth of that doesn't generally come through. So going back to the book, a lot's happened in 4 years. What have been some of the biggest surprises, looking at the histories, looking at some of the fundamentals? Obviously, we've had some major global events over the last 4 years, big swings. But what have been the main things that you and your publisher got up one morning and said, right, we have to come up with a second edition?
When I wrote the 2018 version, I thought, well, maybe batteries will help a little bit around the margins because batteries do help you store daytime power for the evening. But they're also quite expensive. They don't actually make a lot of sense on the residential level economically. I think this will be marginal. You know what? A lot more batteries have been built than I thought would be, and they've got a lot cheaper. And I suppose now I've just got to say, look, solar and batteries are going to be a very major part of the solution. Also, hydrogen. I mean, I still don't think hydrogen is there as a solution. I think it's probably overhyped for many applications. But in 2018, it was a very hypothetical thing. And now there's a major amount of investment going in from governments and corporations in electrolysis facilities and what's mostly actually just factories to make electrolyzers or in electrolyzers to make hydrogen. I suppose my main theory on this is that nobody else has really figured out a better way of doing seasonal storage.
Right.
So when you plug this into a model for a net zero and ask the model to output a net zero pathway for 2050, the model goes, oh, we better build hydrogen. We better make hydrogen and store it until there isn't much sun because otherwise our power system will fall down and you haven't let us do anything else. I sort of hope there's a better way because hydrogen is expensive and making hydrogen, storing it and then burning it in gas plants is quite a high cost solution. It's great for making fertilizer and making steel and all kinds of things like that. But for power storage, it's not ideal.
And I suppose the other thing that's changed between COVID, resulting kind of changes in interest rates, which obviously massively impact project finance, and then, last year, well, actually at this point, 2 years ago, the invasion of Ukraine, which then set off, a complete cascade in terms of the energy kind of view around the world. How much has that impacted what you had to change in this new edition?
So the biggest impact was actually the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which meant that prices for natural gas on the world market soared really high. Europe started buying all the liquefied natural gas on ships, and that meant that prices just soared. And in the first edition of my book, I spent a lot of time talking about how expensive the subsidies for solar proved to be and how much had been poured into them. And you know what? After 2022, nobody cared. They were like, you know what? Every megawatt of solar or wind we've got is great. It's saving us money. This is not that big a deal. So that side was good. And even interest rates going up, it's not great for project financing, especially for wind. But actually, solar capex has come down, so it's really not that big a deal.
That's interesting. I mean, in talking to developers over the last year, I suppose that's been something where, you know, one of them just said it's kind of squeaky bum time in thinking about how they're actually going to make margins. And in fact, I don't know if you saw this David Wallace Wells column in the New York Times, no reason you should have, but although he does quote some Bloomberg NEF data from your team, I think, talking about the headline in the piece is, you know, the missing profits may be a problem for the green transition, and goes into some detail about, you know, why the differential, or at least the perceived differential in profitability between oil and gas and renewables is a long-term problem, and throws on the table the idea that the only way to solve it is to avoid private investment entirely and have it be publicly owned. So I guess my question to you is the, particularly in terms of solar, and you're making a face that makes me suggest that I'm guessing some reaction to that argument, but, you know, is interest rates putting some more pressure on that? Is that, from your view, because you've got the best view in the world in terms of having the views about pipeline and everything else, do you think that you're seeing long-term, are you worried about the continuing investment in terms of solar projects and other renewables?
Nah. There's a couple of things here. There was a transient effect whereupon solar module prices and wind turbine prices went up slightly after the disruption caused by COVID in a period of endless supply. And and at the same time, interest rates went up. And what that meant is that if you're a developer and you'd signed a power contract in 2020, for example, then you would have been looking at a much lower price that you needed. So then when you're trying to build that project, you are kind of screwed because 2020 prices are not there anymore. If you're coming back to the table in 2024, though, you probably just ask for a higher price, and you probably get it. The other thing is that solar equipment costs actually fell 50% last year again, or solar module prices fell 50% last year again, after I got the book to press. So in fact, there's some headroom on the equipment side again. But yeah, a lot of this is just you have to go back to the table and negotiate. You have to, if you're a developer, you've got to say, look, I can build this, but you've got to pay me more than we were talking in 2020. Or you've got to pay me the same as we were talking in 2020, despite the fact that the equipment is now cheaper.
Right. I mean, that is something I was, you know, it's always a bit sensitive. And I was going to ask, because I, you know, was looking at the 24 cent per watt figure on the cover.
It's 11.5 now, you know.
Ooh, yeah.
I know, that's bad, isn't it?
It's not necessarily bad in some ways, but I think but yeah, we've all been there. And I think that if you're going to have if it had gone up to, I don't know, 75 cents a watt instead, then that might have changed things in a different direction.
I know, but it's so embarrassing. I'm going to have to do another edition.
Well, I mean, there's always more room on the bookshelves, I think. But so tell them, I mean, one of the other things that I think that you cover a lot in the book, and I think that obviously it's reflecting, you know, either conversation or some things with Jigar Shah at the U.S. Department of Energy now with the loan program, him having been a kind of pioneer in financing solar projects. One of the things that he's talked about, and I think that you have been a little bit skeptical of, is the potential for virtual power plants. So kind of jumping around a little bit here, so forgive me, but I want to get into a little bit about, because I've heard you talk a lot about grid as much as anything else over the last few months, which is not uncommon in the space. But in particular, just to start there with virtual power plants, just the understanding their potential, you know, this has been a hot topic now. You quote Jigar Shah in the book. I've heard him speak about a month ago on a panel with the Rocky Mountain Institute talking about this. What's your view about whether or not we're having a kind of cycle about hype about this and what the real potential is?
I feel like every couple of years we have a cycle of hype about virtual power plants. That's the issue. And I feel like I've been here before. And so I love Jigger. His role also is to get these things done and get them deployed. It's not necessarily to be realistic about them. My role is to be realistic about things. And the problem with virtual power plants is that you're usually aggregating quite small units, like individual customer solar or battery plants, and sometimes demand like loads that are flexible. And this is an awesome idea. There's all kinds of things we can do to use our electricity better by spreading it around locally, by using it in the daytime when it's available, by using batteries to provide other services that stabilize the grid. This is it. Like in theory, this is super great that you could use this existing capacity to do all those things. In practice, when you try and get people together to like let a utility, for example, run their assets, then people tend not to want to do that unless you pay them quite a lot of money. And when you do pay them a lot of money, they'll do it, but then you have paid them a lot of money, so it's not that cheap anymore. And a lot of the time people buy solar and batteries not for the economic reasons particularly, but because they want to be off-grid, they want to not be involved with their utility, they want to be less reliant. And then they don't want to cut a deal with the utility to let the utility use their system. So the sort of friction of aggregating all these individual consumers, all of whom want to be paid, none of whom want a complicated life. None of us want a complicated life. Most people don't even want to read their electricity bills, I think. It's very difficult to set up virtual power plants. And that's why they haven't achieved mass volumes of deployment so far.
Right. And I think that you would not be alone in this, but I think that just gets us into a wider issue about the connectivity levels and the grid. I mean, this is obviously the scarcity at the moment seems to be, grid connection, grid, further, build out of the grid. It's obviously more intense than old centralized fossil fuel generation and what you need to connect all the way to the edge. So, what's your views, even since having, put your final edition to the printer, about how the conversation has been moving about grid, both in the US and Europe, other places? Some people predicted it was going to feature heavily at COP28. I think it didn't, maybe as much as some people thought it might. What's your view about the state of that conversation? Are we really having a realistic picture about what we need to be doing with the grid in order to realize the potential for solar in particular?
I think we are actually making progress. The thing about grids is usually that the discussion gets quite boring and quite local as well. So in the US, the IRA has a big chunk that is both for building grid and also for doing grid studies to figure out where to build grid, because that's obviously also very important. You don't just want to build it without thinking about where. So various European countries are taking steps to sort of look at their transmission investment plans, how to get that money deployed, where to get it deployed, how to encourage project developers to build even before the grid is there in some cases. The UK has planned to join up offshore wind plants around the edges rather than transmitting it all to the middle. Yes. It's all quite clever. It's all quite local. There is actually a lot of it going on.
Right. Okay. And I think so. That's interesting to know. That you don't perhaps see that as much of a barrier as maybe some other analysts do in the medium term. But in terms of the wider piece, people have referred to this over the years as the solar coaster. We have wild periods of subsidy, followed by building, followed by plants, followed by then a bust cycle when prices drop or the incentives get pulled away, etc. I suppose when it was a very small number in terms of our reliance on it as a system, that was kind of interesting, but didn't really matter. But as we're now getting to a place where, this becomes mission critical, we're relying on this stuff day to day, week to week, planning for it, does that become more of a concern that we have, when people have these type of spectacular blowouts when, a factory winds up not getting built or gets built and then winds up being abandoned, or the price model that you put in for your project winds up being so completely out of line that it just doesn't wind up getting built? Is it more of a worry at scale, I guess?
I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, the thing you've got to know is that all this affects the new build, but it doesn't particularly affect what's already been built. The stuff you've built will just sit there, and when it's sunny, it will generate. And yes, the companies who made it may go bankrupt. I mean, usually will go bankrupt, but it doesn't matter that much. I mean, And the other thing that as prices come down, but also as they actually, in a way, become less volatile because the modules are a smaller part of the total system cost,
Right.
it hopefully becomes less important. Exactly. Like the prices are not varying quite as much. And by the way, there's never been a down year for total solar build, as far as I know.
Okay. Fair enough.
So even a bust, like a big bust, which I think we are going into right now, is a function of there being too many factories built, and therefore the weakest ones will drop out. And rather than there actually being a decline in demand, it's actually almost certainly an increase in demand. Probably another 25% this year.
25%. Okay, I was going to ask you that. That's interesting. And how much of that do you reckon going to be driven by China versus the rest of the world? Because we've heard some, kind of staggering numbers about what China put down, 250 megawatts last year, and of the 400 in total.
Yeah, I mean, China is roughly half the world market at this point.
Right.
And one of the bigger, and obviously that makes it a huge uncertainty in our forecasts. The only thing I would say is that even China might struggle to grow much from 240 gigawatts a year, because that's a lot. Like China really has built ultra high voltage transmission lines out to the desert to build energy megabases, which are basically massive, great solar and wind plants out on what they call wasteland and desert. And it's also put solar on roofs in many places. And there are starting to be some negative feedback mechanisms. So there's even some grid congestion. Some counties in Guangdong are actually slowing down rooftop build because they have just too much rooftop solar for now.
Well, that actually leads me to one other question that I think is something that I've been kind of had in the back of my mind for a while, is when you start to see not just even negative prices in certain markets like California or, in Europe that happen, almost on a daily basis now, where you just have more solar that can be used or stored at a given moment at peak, during a sunny day. But again, when these things get to a scale where I don't know, a particular newspaper, let's say here in the UK, might decide to splash on their front page for reasons of the best known to themselves, that we're wasting X billion a year on solar that's not being used when it could be because it's just not being fed into the grid, or wind in our case, more likely in the UK. Do you see curtailment becoming any kind of a salient issue in particular markets around the world as we see this mismatch between the capacity that we could be shipping and we could be using versus what actually winds up being used?
I mean, there's two issues here. There is local curtailment due to there not being enough grid. And there is curtailment due to very basic supply and demand mismatches. And certainly when you model the global power system with a lot of solar and wind, you do get enough curtailment that it has a huge impact on power economics, because if a lot of the power that you're generating you cannot sell at a positive price, that's an issue. So I very much do think this will be an issue probably by 2030. And this part of the solution to this has to lie outside solar and wind and into making our use of power more flexible. Like we can look at it from the consumer side, though in fact probably it's more for commercial and industrial users. But already with solar panels, I'm like, oh, it's sunny, I'll go and do some laundry now, or I'll cook a roast dinner now and it can sit for a bit. And so there are ways in which you can shift it. Right. It's very difficult shifting it seasonally as a consumer, because you do want a warm house in the winter.
Indeed, and for a solar analyst, hearing you talk as much about wind as you have in the last few months was something I think a lot of people found remarkable. So, give us a little bit more. Are you almost concerned that people have gotten a little bit too carried away with the potential for solar to solve, a lot of the energy transition challenges?
A little bit.
Okay.
Especially in seasonal climates like Northern Europe.
Right.
This is probably less of a problem if you're anywhere near the equator, because the day length doesn't change that much over the year. And also a lot of your power demand is going to be driven by air conditioning. And air conditioning and solar are a great combination. For Northern Europe, we use most of our power in the winter. That difference is going to get more extreme as we electrify heating with heat pumps and such things. And solar really does not generate much in the winter. I think my house generates, I've got exact numbers somewhere, but my house generates like 10% of the December power use that it needs from its solar panels, and in July it generates like 3 times as much as it needs.
Right.
It's not a small difference, and that does mean that the biggest battery that you could possibly build would drain in the winter. And if you're also trying to build wind, but every day solar is pushing your power prices to zero, that impacts your wind bills as well, because it means that wind farms make less money. Right. And so there is an argument. I think we should prioritize wind in Northern Europe because wind blows at night and in the winter. And that puts us building wind would put us on a much better pathway to get to actual net zero than building a load of solar and hoping.
There's so many other things I could ask you about, but I'm conscious of time, and you've been very generous with having a chance to talk to us. I did want to ask one last thing, which is on, I've heard you speak, and you comes across very well in the book, your hopes for, what solar can do for places outside of the, quote, developed world in terms of its potential to help, different communities leapfrog dependence on fossil fuels and even necessarily potentially grid infrastructure. Maybe can you say a little bit about that, things you wrote about in the book and your own views on that?
So this is I've been following solar in Africa for the whole period. It's difficult because in the financial community, it's difficult to get people to care about solar in Africa. It's very hard to make money off poor people. But that is also where we have to see a lot of the growth happening if there's going to be growth at all. So if you're trying to sell solar panels, you probably need to be selling them to Africa simply because nowhere else will be needing that much of them. I mean, just as a number, our current forecast of solar build by 2030 is just under 6 terawatts of solar around the world. Total installed power capacity at the end of 22 was about 8.5 terawatts. So you got solar suddenly almost getting close to the size of the entire power fleet, and that is going to make a difference. And so if you want to keep selling solar panels, you have to start selling them to new power demand. And a lot of that is hopefully going to be in Africa. And now these solar panels are super cheap. And people there often probably don't care if they don't get power all night. If they can charge their laptop, charge their phone, charge their lights, it's probably okay. And what I'm hoping is that this turns into a sort of virtuous circle. Cheap solar gives cheap electricity, gives development, leads to economic growth, helps people get more money, they buy more solar, they don't ever need to build a centralized fossil fuel-fired infrastructure at all. Right. That's my hope. But it is a bit utopian.
Well, I suppose that's a good place to kind of move on to my final question to you. We ask everyone who comes on the show to give some recommendations to our listeners about things that have influenced them. And I know one of the things you mentioned was sci-fi in general. I suppose utopian sci-fi is where that meeting point from that last answer was. So maybe take it away and give us your thoughts on 3 things that you might recommend for our listeners to help shape your views.
Oh, I wasn't sure we were meant to be recommending them. I thought they were meant to be influential. But yeah, I mean, I've always been a huge fan of science fiction. Yeah. And the great thing about science fiction, and I have no time for people who want to carve out climate fiction into its own thing, because science fiction has always been the genre that can imagine that you can reshape the world. Science fiction is about it can be about terraforming, it can be about making the world worse, it can be about utopian stuff. It's really about thinking about how we can do things differently rather than just tomorrow being the same as today. Not that it's necessarily very useful as a prediction, but it is good. And so there's a 1992 novel by Maureen F. McHugh called China Mountain Zhang, which is a really good, really early climate-aware novel that works as a novel, but is also about a world that is recovering from climate change and turning it around. Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry of the Future is also very good. That works less well as a novel, to be honest, but as a series of reasonable issues coming up. The bits in Zurich are really boring, but is a very intelligent book about a plausible future, and also with a sense of urgency. And I guess if I had to, other science fiction, The Expanse is really good. Oh. For All Mankind on Apple Plus is brilliant. Right?
Yes.
I know I haven't quite caught up with it, so we're going to have to hurry up in this household. But no spoilers.
But yeah, no, that's fascinating. One of the things that's made you the star that you are today is the platform formerly known as Twitter, where annually you publish a monster series of predictions. So that's been a community that's been in flux as that platform has had its challenges. Do you see that continuing to be an important part of how you communicate?
So yeah, we all think Elon Musk is a bit of a liability, to say the least. Energy Twitter has been a huge part of helping me get to see people's views outside BNEF. And it's been amazing. It's amazing to be part of a community which talks about energy, sometimes talks past each other, sometimes corrects each other, but is generally committed to saying things that are true and giving different perspectives. And so Energy Twitter has been amazing. There is a move to Energy Blue Sky, which I'm part of, and also Energy Mastodon. So, I am a little bit diversified, and hopefully the kind of social media conversations will continue.
Well, look, I mean, thank you so much for the time, Jenny, and it's been really great to talk to you. And everyone, of course, who, anybody who hasn't picked up the second edition, I highly recommend it. Hugely important, and obviously available at all good booksellers. And I would also say that we look forward to seeing more of you on Blue Sky. I can't do Mastodon. I just can't get my head around it. Blue Sky is about as much as I can go. But it's been great to talk to you, and good luck with the geese. Hopefully they're having a good winter, and I'd love to talk to you again sometime.
Thank you very much for having me, Richard. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Jenny. And we're back. Thanks, guys, for hanging around. So I'm here with Paul O'Donoghue, the Ireland reporter for Renews.biz, and John Reynolds, a freelance journalist whose work you can see in The Currency, the Irish Independent, and the Irish Sunday Independent. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying around.
Of course. No problem.
Thanks.
Good stuff. Well, I think we wanted to head into sort of our lightning round, as it were, but also before I get to a couple of maybe a little bit lighter bits, I guess I wanted to just ask a broad question about the sector itself and looking at the health of climate tech generally. I mean, like, you look at numbers from PwC or from, kind of different kind of investment houses, and you see like a 10% CAGR kind of rate for growth in the sector, broadly speaking, whether it be, in renewables, grid enhancing tech, other aspects, kind of building tech, software, other things that allow for greater efficiency. And, when I was looking around and seeing how the sector is being covered or thought about in Ireland, and I do know somebody's actually trying to close out a fund covering the sector and is kind of having a little bit of trouble. So I'm wondering, like, has it just not really caught on as being kind of a hot sector to want to work in? Looking at the Dublin Tech Summit that was happening this week, looking in your colleagues in The Currency, John, covering this, I see Bupka's zero, zilch reference to climate at all. It's all AI and quantum computing and some other stuff. So maybe I can go to you first, Paul. I mean, like, again, it's even a nebulous term. What is climate tech? But, given it's broadly about all those things, is it surprising to you at all that this hasn't really seems to have caught fire?
I mean, for me, I think it kind of comes back to the infrastructure thing, which is kind of like, it kind of nearly feels redundant talking about it because it's just something you can kind of talk about endlessly and the problems are just always the same. But that kind of does seem to be a big sticking point for renewable development. So we were kind of talking earlier about how, kind of grid capacity issues means that there's effectively kind of like a hard cap as to how much you can kind of build out. And because when you kind of couple that with the fact of how kind of slow it is to develop infrastructure here, it just means that there's effectively kind of a limit as to how much you can grow and how quickly you can grow. So I do think that kind of puts a bit of a dampener on the field when you even compare it to something like tech or finance or whatever it may be, where you can grow, very quickly. You can kind of go into kind of a lot of different markets and kind of, trade a lot of different people very fast. Whereas if you're looking to kind of build out renewables in Ireland, it's going to be a lot of dotting I's and crossing T's and filling out forms and all this stuff. So not quite as glamorous. You're working on a much longer timeline as well, and there's more of a limit to it. Is kind of the impression that I would get.
Right. And John, I mean, so what it does need to happen? I mean, actually, before I get there, I just remembered, like, somewhere behind me in the books is a copy of Tom Garvin's Preventing the Future, the UCD academic wrote book like 20 years ago, documenting why Ireland was poor for so long, and essentially this coalition of vested interests that prevented, economic development, really. It doesn't feel like there's any malicious plot to stop, the sector and renewables and more broadly in the climate tech space taking off in Ireland. But John, what needs to change, for that to be a real driver of economic growth. As again, people like and Eamon Ryan who see that as being like the Biden administration in America, like Rachel Reeves, Red Miliband to the Labour Party here in the UK, see it as a potential source of future economic growth and competitiveness in the world. What needs to change, for that to be a real driver?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things there. If you compared Ireland to, say, somewhere, smallish, similar size economy like Austria, Denmark, or Sweden, you notice that they're very, they've got much more heavier amounts of innovation happening there. I mean, in fact, Irish Times columnist who might be well known to some of your listeners, Fintan O'Toole, was actually touching on that earlier this week. He was writing about, how Ireland isn't great at innovation. And again, I look at this from time to time as well. And I was, if you look at there's various international rankings for innovation, and, in some of them, actually, Ireland has actually gone down a few places, which is quite disheartening, really. We do have a wealth of university talent here. There's a lot of money that's gone into that whole sort of third level research. I do wonder about how much of that is just funding people with, to do PhDs. And again, unfortunately, with so many of these issues, a lot of it comes back to the housing crisis in terms of attracting talent, living costs, etc. Is Dublin, for example, an attractive place to start a climate tech startup? Possibly not. You might prefer to go to, say, Cork, where there's a lot been happening in the marine, tidal, wave energy side of things. As a startup, you might even, prefer to look to, say, somewhere like Waterford or Galway. Unfortunately, we don't have the level of international prowess that somewhere like, say, Cambridge or Oxford would have in the university ranking. So that's probably one issue. I think it's quite interesting that you touched on sort of what the US is doing, and I suppose that was one thing which does always resonate with me. We were talking about Eddie O'Connor earlier, just the fact that he was such a visionary in this space. He was 20, probably 30 years, maybe more ahead of his time in terms of he seemed to be able to see the path that that all of this was going down. Was going down. He built the first offshore wind farm here, the Arklow Bank, 20 years ago now, and ever since, we haven't had any offshore wind farm. So that's really kind of just one example. And you touched on sort of the state apparatus there. And actually, funnily enough, that was one issue that Eddie had when he was at Bord na Móna. He was, his role there was to, unfortunately, make redundancies and change it and get it fit for, for some of the challenges that it was going to face in the years to come. And again, now we look at somewhere like Bord na Móna, which it actually now has a climate tech accelerator. So, you can make of that what you will. You would, perhaps ask, whether this is kind of 10, 20 years too late. We've also had another semi-state, the ESB here. They had a climate tech VC sort of offshoot, which was originally called Novus Modus, which they were actually one of the early funders of Grid.Beyond, who we were talking about earlier. So again,
okay.
there was an example of some vision there. And again, if I talk to one or two of the well-known venture capitalists in this space who are funding the likes of Grid.Beyond, they would say that there's probably a need for a climate tech startup hub here, something which could perhaps draw on some of that university talent, get them experimenting. I would even probably raise another point around Northern Ireland, for example, and whether there might be a place there at some point in the future for maybe a joint European, US, Irish, and UK climate tech focused, either be it an R&D hub or some other operation. For another thing that you could look at, draw inspiration from, if you like, here in Ireland is the Young Scientist exhibition, which we have every year. And now, from that, we're starting actually to get interesting ideas, and entrepreneurs actually get funded after presenting their research there. So there are elements of inspiration here. but we still seem to be slightly lacking at the policy level, and maybe even around different aspects of this that some of the VCs could perhaps inject some real life into. I know, for example, our current Taoiseach, Simon Harris, he actually in November last year announced the establishment of two third level R&D centres, one of which was focused on climate tech and the other was focused on food security. And they are actually joint UK, Northern Ireland and Irish initiatives. So, there may be the beginnings there of some of this, but again, it's likely to be a bit more time before we see some of that evolve and develop. And I suppose one point which, I always sort of talk about to the various VCs here about is the fact that while if you look at Supernode and Grid Beyond, they're examples of what's being done in that sort of hard tech space. But if you look at some of the research that's been done by the likes of PwC on the actual focusing in on the climate tech sector, you will see that there's more of a tendency for the kind of the soft tech side of things, which maybe uses AI or, maybe using software as a service startups. And so again, there's that element around if you were looking to start a hard climate tech startup, would you look to Ireland, particularly when, as Paul has touched on, if you look at some of those infrastructure issues, if you were looking for a country that has the best infrastructure, you would probably look elsewhere, unfortunately. And so you do wonder, whether that is having an impact as well as we look at this.
And then finally, I want to go to, I don't know what to call this segment. Like sometimes, everyone's got a cute name for, I think the energy gang, people call it their free electrons, but everybody coming to the party with kind of an interesting story that they've been keeping an eye on, maybe sometimes a little bit off beam. And John, I'll start with you because I think you had identified that I had not been aware of, to me anyway, that a climate tech stroke renewables stroke business guy going way back who's been in this space for decades is actually on the ballot for the European elections next week. So John, what is going on?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So that man you're referring to is John Mullins, whose background is in Bord Gáis and also in the solar company Amarenco. And he's now on the ballot for the Ireland South EU constituency as a candidate for Fine Gael. And, I was just looking at an ad of his recently. He's talking about rural issues, about farming issues. So, yeah, it's quite interesting that we see someone like that, someone with that business background moving into the political fold. It would be interesting, for example, if he's someone, were he elected, who could help perhaps drive some of these issues around the supergrid, for example. It'd be quite interesting to see, how much, given his background in energy in particular, whether he's someone who emerges as some sort of political visionary, with that business background, that probably mean, that will mean that he's someone who's, perhaps best placed more than many others to know some of these, issues around infrastructure policy, example, really inside out, because he would have experienced them certainly at Amarenco, and no doubt to a certain extent also in his time at Bord Gáis.
And does he get a shot?
Sorry?
Does he have a shot?
Again, there's a lot of candidates, so, you would have to say he probably does.
I'm sorry. I promised I wouldn't make you a political prognosticator, John. So I'm breaking my promise. But I did see that there was a poll out in the Irish Times on the 18th of May that put him at, I think, in fourth place in terms of first preference votes for that constituency in the south of Ireland. So I think there's another Fine Gael candidate who I think is topping that poll in terms of first prefs. But it'll be interesting. I don't even know how many seats there are in South. But it'll be interesting to see if he comes through. Definitely. Also, I did see that he had something on TikTok, a campaign video of him with a hurley hitting a ball, talking about his involvement in the stadium locally. Renewables did get one mention, but gosh, I do wonder about the wisdom of, John must be my age or a bit older. And so the idea of like me putting out a video on TikTok for the youth, like the comments. Oh my God, there's just savage under the video. But
They were nice on
anyway.
LinkedIn.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
You'd hope so. You'd hope so. I mean, it's a slightly different demo. But Paul, what have you been keeping an eye on?
So I was just looking at this Irish company called Silicate. So it's just been selected as a finalist for basically like a big prestigious prize, the X Prize. So 50 million grand prize, which is a lot of money, obviously, for a startup. In terms of the name, X Prize obviously sounds a bit weird. It's because the prize is from the Musk Foundation. Elon Musk famously likes the letter X, so that kind of explains the name behind it. But yeah, like the company itself, so Silicate is the name of the Irish company which has been nominated. So they're one of 20 finalists, which is, obviously great for them. So what they do, the whole kind of prize basically is focused around carbon removal. So that's what the 50 million prize fund is for the company that they think it has the best shot of removing the most carbon from the atmosphere. So Silicate, the way it works is basically they take used kind of waste or crushed concrete. They buy it from, people are just going to chuck it basically. They process it, adding chemicals in some kind of production, that is beyond my understanding. But basically they process it in such a way that once you put it on agricultural land, it improves the soil, and it kind of, at the same time, it's good for farmers. It improves the soil, and it also helps take carbon out of the atmosphere. So like it's kind of doing a couple of things. It's obviously, a good kind of use for an otherwise useless product, which is, waste concrete, helps farmers and helps remove carbon from the atmosphere. So what's not to love,
Excellent. Well, look, I was going to have my own, but I think we've run out of time, and I'm going to leave it there. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Paul O'Donoghue, Ireland reporter with Renews.biz.
Cheers, pleasure.
And John Reynolds, a freelance journalist whose work you can see in The Currency, The Irish Independent, The Sunday Independent, and I'm sure many more to come. Thanks for joining us as well.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
It's been a pleasure.
And I hope you guys will both come back. I hope we can talk more the coming months just to check in on some of these things. I'm fascinated, as you know, having anybody who has spent 10 years living in the country, kind of develops a little bit of an affection for the place. And so, a bit of a soft spot in my heart to make sure the old place does well, if you can forgive that accent, because you're not here to hit me, so it's fine.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, gents.
Look forward
Cheers.
to it. Thanks.
Thanks to my guests, John Reynolds and Paul O'Donoghue, and especially to Jenny Chase of Bloomberg NEF, who has been very patient waiting for this conversation to come out, but we thought we wanted to save it for our penultimate episode before our 50th, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And now to play us out, if you don't know them, you should. Irish band Inhaler, It Won't Always Be Like This. Over to you, Theo.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delevan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delevan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.